A black elderly man helps a Hell's Angel fix his broken bike on a quiet Alabama road. But what he sees next makes him cry. He thought he was just helping a stranger. But when the biker pulls out a photo, the old man's world shatters. The man in that picture is his son, the one he lost years ago. As thunder rolls and the truth unfolds, their meeting starts to feel less like chance and more like something divine. But when the town turns against them and the past refuses to stay buried, faith alone might not be enough to save either of them. Two men, one carrying guilt, the other grief, brought together by a miracle neither asked for. What secret did the biker bring from the son's final days? And when forgiveness costs everything, will the old man still believe that grace can save them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The cicadas sang their relentless summer song as Pastor Matthew Turner's weathered hands moved carefully over the inner workings of an old Philco radio. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across his workbench. The space smelled of wood shavings and machine oil, a familiar comfort he'd known for decades. At 72 years old, Matthew found peace in these quiet moments, though they couldn't completely silence the ache in his heart. 15 years was a long time to go without hearing your son's voice. The thought of David brought a familiar tightness to his chest, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the delicate circuitry before him. Just last week, little Tommy Jefferson had watched him repair Mrs. Henderson's vintage radio, his bright eyes wide with wonder. "How do you know which wire goes where, Pastor Turner?" the 10-year-old had asked. "Same way you learn anything worth knowing," Matthew had replied, smiling. Patience, practice, and paying attention to the small details. The neighborhood children often stopped by his workshop, drawn by curiosity and Matthew's gentle way of teaching. He showed them how to hold tools properly, how to diagnose problems, and most importantly, how to be honest about their mistakes. These moments helped fill the void left by David's absence, though they never quite sealed the wound. The church bell rang noon, its deep tone rolling across Mason Ridge like a wave. Matthew straightened his back, feeling the familiar crack of joints that reminded him of his age. Through the open workshop door, he could see his garden where tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. The humidity pressed down like a warm, wet blanket, typical for an Alabama summer day. The sound came gradually at first, a distant rumble that grew louder, cutting through the drone of cicadas. Matthew recognized the troubled rhythm of a motorcycle engine in distress. The sound wobbled and coughed, getting closer until it wheezed to a final, rattling. "Stop right in front of his gate." Setting down his screwdriver, Matthew moved to the workshop doorway. A large motorcycle lay tilted on its kickstand, chrome dulled by road dust. Its rider, a massive man in worn leather, knelt beside the bike. Even from this distance, Matthew could see the man's arms were covered in tattoos, the images disappearing beneath his sleeveless jacket. "Come on, girl," the biker muttered, his voice rough with frustration. "Don't do this to me now." Matthew watched, his hand resting on the doorframe. The man's presence stirred something uncomfortable in his gut, a mixture of caution and unease that he wasn't proud of feeling. In all his years of ministry, he'd learned that fear often masked itself as judgment, and neither had any place in a Christian heart. The biker looked up then, squinting against the sun. His face was weathered, marked by years that had likely been harder than Matthew's own. "Hey there," he called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "Any chance I could get some water? For me and the bike?" Matthew hesitated. The voice in his head that sounded like his late wife, Sarah, whispered, "What would Jesus do?" But another voice, the one shaped by 72 years of living in a world that wasn't always kind to black men who trusted too easily, counseled caution. Then a different voice spoke in his heart, quiet but clear as the church bell had been moments ago. "Help him." Matthew straightened his shoulders, deciding that faith had to be more than just words spoken from a pulpit on Sunday mornings. "I've got water," he called back, "and tools too if you need them." The biker's face showed surprise, then relief. "Name's Mick," he said, standing up. His height was impressive, but his smile was unexpectedly gentle. "Appreciate the offer, Pastor. Bike's running hot and something's not right with the carburetor." Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly at being called pastor. He wasn't wearing his collar, and nothing about his workshop clothes suggested his profession. As if reading his mind, Mick gestured toward the church visible just down the road. "Saw the church sign when I rolled in. Figured the house behind it might belong to Matthew Turner." Nodding slowly, Matthew stepped out of his workshop. "That's right, though most folks around here just call me Pastor Turner." He crossed the small yard to the gate, his steps measured and deliberate. Up close, Mick's tattoos told stories of their own. Some Matthew recognized from his military days, others he'd seen in his ministry to prison inmates. "Let me get you that water first," Matthew said, unlatching the gate. "Then we can take a look at your bike. I may be more familiar with radios these days, but I still remember my way around an engine." The surprise returned to Mick's face, mixed with something that looked like respect. Wouldn't have expected a preacher to know much about motorcycles. Matthew allowed himself a small smile. There's a lot people don't expect, from preachers. Jesus was full of surprises too. He headed toward the house, feeling Mick's curious gaze following him. "Bring your bike into the shade of the workshop. No sense standing out here in this heat while we figure out what's wrong." As he filled 2 glasses with cold water from the kitchen tap, Matthew could hear the motorcycle being wheeled across his driveway. The sound of gravel crunching under boots was followed by a low whistle, probably Mick taking in the collection of radios in various states of repair that lined the workshop shelves. Through the window, Matthew watched the big man examining an old Motorola with careful hands, showing a gentleness that belied his intimidating appearance. Perhaps, Matthew thought, this was why that quiet voice had urged him to help, because God often worked through unexpected encounters, teaching lessons about judgment and mercy to those willing to learn them. Carrying the glasses of water, Matthew stepped back into the afternoon heat, ready to offer help to a stranger who might have more in common with him than first appearances suggested. The cicadas continued their song, accompanying what felt like the beginning of something significant, though Matthew couldn't have said exactly what that might be. Matthew walked toward the gate, the glass pitcher sweating in his hands. The ice clinked softly against the sides as he approached the stranger, whose leather vest was now dark with perspiration in the Alabama heat. Though his heart still held a shadow of unease, Matthew's steps were steady and purposeful. "Here you go," he said, extending the pitcher. "Might want to take it slow. Too much cold water when you're overheated isn't good for you." Mick accepted the pitcher with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly, a detail that didn't escape Matthew's notice. The big man took several long swallows before lowering the pitcher, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Thank you, Pastor. Don't think I knew how thirsty I was until now." "You said you were heading to Montgomery?" Matthew asked, keeping his voice neutral as he studied the motorcycle. It was a well-maintained Harley-Davidson, despite its current troubles. The chrome still gleamed beneath the road dust. "Yes, sir," Mick nodded, handing the pitcher back. "Got business there, but this old girl had other ideas." He patted the bike's fuel tank affectionately. "Engine just quit on me. No warning, nothing. Just dead." Matthew set the pitcher down on his workshop steps and moved closer to the motorcycle, his experienced eyes scanning the machine. Years of fixing everything from military vehicles to church maintenance equipment had taught him to spot problems quickly. "Might be the carburetor," he said, more to himself than to Mick. "These older models can be temperamental in this heat." He stood there for a moment, aware of the awkward silence stretching between them. The cicadas droned on, their endless song filling the air with a familiar southern symphony. Matthew glanced at the sky, still several hours of daylight left. The thought of sending this man away without help didn't sit right with his conscience, despite his initial reservations. "I've got tools," he said finally, gesturing toward his workshop. "If you'd like, we could take a look at it together." Relief washed over Mick's weathered face. "That's mighty kind of you, Pastor. I'd appreciate that." Together, they wheeled the heavy motorcycle into the relative cool of the workshop. The familiar smell of metal, oil, and wood shavings enveloped them. Matthew's collection of radios lined the shelves, their dials catching the late afternoon light that streamed through the dusty windows. Matthew opened his toolbox, the hinges creaking slightly. The tools inside were organized with military precision, another habit he'd never lost from his army days. He selected a wrench and handed it to Mick, noticing the man's hands were still shaking slightly. The knuckles were a map of old scars, telling stories Matthew wasn't sure he wanted to hear. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds being metal against metal and their measured breathing. Occasionally, one would ask the other to hold something or pass a tool, the words coming out careful and measured, like they were testing the air between them. Mick's eyes kept drifting to the worn Bible sitting on Matthew's workbench. It was well used, its pages dog-eared, and its leather cover soft with age. Matthew noticed these glances but said nothing, focusing instead on the task at hand. "You've worked on bikes before," Mick observed after a while, breaking the silence. It wasn't quite a question. Matthew nodded, adjusting his grip on the wrench. "In another life. Vietnam. Kept our vehicles running when we had to." "Afghanistan for me," Mick replied quietly, though I wasn't exactly on the mechanical side of things. The afternoon light was growing golden when Matthew's hand slipped while tightening a particularly stubborn bolt. He started to stumble backward, but Mick's hand shot out with surprising speed, catching his elbow and steadying him. The moment was brief, but charged with unexpected connection. Two men, so different on the surface, linked by a simple act of instinct and care. "Thank you," Matthew said softly, straightening himself. Mick nodded, already turning back to the bike. But something had shifted in the workshop's atmosphere, the tension easing like a loosened knot. They worked for another hour, making adjustments and testing connections. Finally, Mick turned the key, and the Harley roared to life, its deep rumble echoing off the workshop walls. The sound was smooth and strong, no hint of its earlier troubles. Matthew began wiping his hands on a shop rag, ready to step back and bid this stranger farewell. But Mick wasn't moving toward the bike. Instead, he was reaching into his vest pocket, his movements suddenly uncertain. The biker removed his helmet, and Matthew was surprised to see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Mick's hands were trembling again as he pulled out a photograph, worn soft at the edges from frequent handling. "You remind me of the man I should have been," Mick said, his voice barely above a whisper as he held out the picture. Matthew took it, curious despite himself. The desert sun in the photograph was harsh, washing out the background into shades of tan and brown. Two men stood arm in arm, wearing combat fatigues. One was Mick, younger but unmistakable, and the other... Matthew's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet as he stared at the familiar face of his son, David. The son he hadn't seen in 15 years. David was smiling in the photo, his arm thrown casually around Mick's shoulders, both of them covered in dust but grinning at the camera as if they shared the world's best secret. His hands began to shake, matching Mick's tremors, as he held this unexpected window into his son's life. A life that had gone on without him. A life that had touched this stranger who now stood in his workshop, bringing with him pieces of a puzzle Matthew hadn't known he was missing. The photograph shook in Matthew's weathered hands, his knees suddenly weak beneath him. He lowered himself onto the porch rail, the old wood creaking softly under his weight. The face of his son, so alive, so vibrant in that sun-bleached image, stared back at him with a smile he hadn't seen in 15 years. Mick's voice cracked as he watched the pastor's reaction. He shifted his weight, leather jacket creaking. I didn't know at first when I saw you, but your eyes, they're just like his, and the way you work with your hands. He trailed off, struggling to find the right words. Matthew couldn't tear his gaze from the photograph. His son's uniform was dusty, but his smile was bright, genuine. The kind of smile he used to wear as a boy, before the argument started, before the silence grew between them like a wall. We were stationed together in Kandahar province, Mick continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. David was our medic. He saved my life. The big man's hands trembled as he leaned against the porch post. We were ambushed during a patrol. I took a hit, bad one. David dragged me to cover, patched me up under heavy fire. He kept talking to me the whole time, telling me to hold on, that my story wasn't finished yet. Tears slid silently down Matthew's cheeks, catching in the creases around his mouth. The cicadas droned in the gathering dusk, their song a counterpoint to the heavy words hanging in the air. But he never made it home, Mick said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 months later, another ambush. He was helping wounded civilians when... He couldn't finish the sentence. The setting sun painted the sky in sheets of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the porch. Matthew's tears glinted in the fading light as he traced his son's face with a trembling finger. I shouldn't have survived that day, Mick continued, his voice raw with guilt. Sometimes I wake up thinking it should have been me instead of him. David had so much good in him, so much to give. I was just a broken man with a dark past. But he saw something in me worth saving. Matthew closed his eyes, feeling the weight of grief press down on his shoulders. The photo felt impossibly heavy in his hands, laden with memories and regret. I've been riding across the country, Mick explained, visiting the families of my fallen brothers, trying to, I don't know, make some sense of it all maybe, pay some kind of respect. Your son, he changed my life. I owed it to him to find you. The evening air had grown cool, carrying the scent of magnolia and freshly cut grass. Matthew stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Would you... He hesitated, pushing past his nervousness. Would you join me for dinner? I've got some stew on the stove and cornbread in the oven. Mick nodded, clearly moved by the invitation. They made their way inside, the screen door closing with a soft snap behind them. The kitchen was warm and smelled of sage and beef broth. They ate in near silence, the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional scrape of chair legs the only sounds. Matthew watched as Mick's eyes kept drifting to the glass case on the mantel, where a carefully folded American flag sat beside photos of David, as a child, in his high school graduation gown, in his uniform at basic training. The stew grew cold in Matthew's bowl as memories washed over him. David's first steps in this very kitchen, his laughter echoing through the house, the slam of the front door during their last argument. So many words left unsaid, so many chances for reconciliation lost to pride and stubbornness. After dinner, Matthew cleared his throat. The back shed has a spare room, he said. It's not much, but there's a clean bed and running water. You're welcome to stay the night." Mick accepted with quiet gratitude, and Matthew showed him to the shed. Once alone, the pastor returned to the porch, sinking into his old rocking chair. The night had fully settled now, wrapping the world in velvet darkness pierced by starlight and the gentle glow from the porch lamp. Cricket song filled the air as Matthew held the photograph, studying his son's face in the dim light. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion, "what are you trying to show me?" The question hung in the humid night air, unanswered but heavy with possibility. The porch creaked softly beneath his chair as he rocked, the familiar motion offering little comfort. His thumb traced the edge of the photograph, feeling where the paper had worn soft from Mick's handling. The confusion in his heart felt as vast as the star-studded sky above. Here was this stranger, this man with rough hands and a troubled past, carrying pieces of his son's final days like precious cargo. Matthew couldn't help but wonder at the mysterious ways God worked, bringing this man to his door, engine failing at just the right moment, carrying a photograph that bridged 15 years of silence. The crickets continued their nighttime symphony, accompanying Matthew's quiet contemplation. The darkness seemed to listen as he sat there, holding his son's smile in his hands, trying to understand the message hidden in this unexpected encounter. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Matthew woke to the familiar sound of a broom scratching against wood. Confused, he shuffled to his front window and pulled back the curtain. There was Mick, methodically sweeping the wraparound porch, his broad shoulders hunched in concentration. Something squeezed into Matthew's chest, a mixture of gratitude and unease. The last person who'd swept that porch had been David, all those years ago. He watched for a moment longer as Mick worked, his movements careful and deliberate, before heading to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Matthew pulled out eggs, bacon, and the last of yesterday's cornbread from the icebox. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of breakfast preparation, mind drifting between past and present. "Smells good," Mick's rough voice came from the doorway. He'd shed his leather jacket, revealing muscled arms covered in faded tattoos. "Didn't mean to wake you with the sweeping." "Been up with the sun most of my life," Matthew replied, sliding eggs onto 2 plates. "Army habit that never quit." He gestured to the small kitchen table. "Sit, eat." They settled into their chairs, the morning light streaming through the window between them. After a brief blessing, they began to eat in what felt like a more comfortable silence than the night before. "David used to love breakfast," Matthew found himself saying, surprising himself with the words. Even as a teenager, when most kids would rather sleep till noon, he'd be up early, helping his mama cook. Mick nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "He was always first one up in our unit, too. Made sure everyone got something to eat, even if it was just those awful military rations." For the first time in years, Matthew felt his lips curve into a genuine smile at a memory of his son. "That sounds like him, always taking care of others." "The day he saved my life," Mick continued carefully, "we were pinned down in this village. Taliban had us surrounded. I'd gotten separated from the unit, took a hit in the leg." He paused, pushing eggs around his plate. "David came back for me. Could have stayed safe with the others, but he wouldn't leave a man behind. Carried me a 1/4 mile under heavy fire." Matthew's throat tightened, but the smile remained. Pride mixed with grief in his chest as he pictured his son's bravery. After breakfast, Mick helped with the dishes, then hesitated by the sink. "That church I saw yesterday, that's yours, right? Would you mind if I visited it?" The question caught Matthew off guard, but he nodded. "Of course. I need to head over there anyway, do some tidying up before Sunday." They walked the short distance to the small white church in companionable silence. The morning air was already thick with humidity, promising another scorching Alabama day. Matthew unlocked the heavy wooden doors, and they stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. The familiar smell of old hymnals and lemon polish filled the air. Matthew busied himself with straightening papers, while Mick stood in the center aisle, taking it all in. Without warning, Mick moved forward and dropped to his knees at the altar. His shoulders began to shake as he whispered prayers too quiet for Matthew to hear, though he caught fragments. "Sorry, Lord. So much blood on these hands. Need your forgiveness." Matthew turned away, giving the man privacy in his moment of raw vulnerability. He occupied himself with mundane tasks, straightening hymnals, adjusting the altar cloth, all the while aware of Mick's continued prayers. Eventually, Mick rose and quietly left the church, mumbling something about needing air. Matthew continued his tasks, working his way through the pews with practiced efficiency. As he approached the pulpit, something caught his eye. His old family Bible lay open, though he distinctly remembered closing it after last Sunday's service. Drawing closer, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. The paper was yellowed with age, its creases well worn from repeated folding and unfolding. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the handwriting, David's distinct, slightly slanted script. With trembling fingers, Matthew lifted the letter. It was addressed simply, "To the man I wronged most, my father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he unfolded the paper. His son's words stared back at him. "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, I guess I never made it home to say these things in person. There's so much I need to tell you, so many wrongs I need to make, right?" Matthew's vision blurred. His hands shook so badly he had to set the letter down on the pulpit. He couldn't read more, not yet. The weight of those first few lines alone threatened to buckle his knees. The letter mentioned someone named Mick, confirming what Matthew had already begun to suspect, that this meeting was no accident, that God's hand had guided this unlikely encounter. In the distance, the church bells tolled the hour, their familiar sound now seeming to carry a different weight. Matthew stared at the letter, his heart pounding against his ribs. Could forgiveness truly reach across the grave? Could a father's wounded heart be healed by words written years ago? The dust motes continued their eternal dance in the colored light, and Matthew stood frozen, caught between the need to know and the fear of what his son's last words might reveal. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Matthew would wake to find Mick already up, usually tinkering with something that needed fixing. The man seemed to have an eye for broken things, perhaps because he saw himself as one. On Tuesday morning, Mick pointed up at the church's roof while they drank their coffee on the porch. "Been meaning to mention, you've got some shingles loose up there. Saw water damage on the ceiling inside, too." Matthew sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "Been trying to find someone willing to tackle that job. Money's tight in the maintenance fund." "I could do it," Mick offered quietly. "Used to work construction between other things." He cleared his throat. "Noticed those front steps need attention too. Wood's rotting on the bottom 3. Matthew studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. Caution still whispered in his mind, but something else spoke louder, the genuine desire to help in Mick's eyes. "That's mighty kind of you to offer." By mid-morning, Mick was up on the roof, carefully replacing damaged shingles, while Matthew handed supplies up the ladder. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, but Mick worked steadily, stopping only when the neighborhood kids gathered to watch. "Mister, are you really a Hell's Angel?" 10-year-old Tommy Jenkins called up, eyes wide with mixed fear and fascination. Matthew tensed, but Mick just wiped his brow and smiled sadly. "Was. Long time ago. These days I'm just trying to be better than I was yesterday." The children crowded closer, full of questions. Soon Mick was teaching them about different types of nails and proper hammer technique, letting them help with the simpler tasks. Their laughter echoed across the churchyard, drawing curious glances from passing townspeople. Word spread through Mason Ridge like wildfire. A Hell's Angel, living with Pastor Turner. Working on the church? The gossip buzzed through beauty parlors and grocery store aisles. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 of the church elders appeared at Matthew's door: Deacon Wilson, Mrs. Henderson, and Mr. Parker. "Pastor," Deacon Wilson began, his smile stretched thin, "we've been hearing some concerning things." Matthew invited them in, served sweet tea in his best glasses. They perched uncomfortably on his sofa, eyeing Mick's leather jacket draped over a kitchen chair. "We're just worried about appearances," Mrs. Henderson said delicately. "The church's reputation." "A man's past don't define his tomorrow," Matthew interrupted firmly, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "Mick's done nothing but help since he arrived. The roof that's needed fixing for 2 years. He's up there right now working in 100-degree heat, asking nothing in return." "But his background," Mr. Parker started. "Was any of us born perfect?" Matthew asked quietly. "Any of us never needed. Grace?" They left soon after, muttering amongst themselves. Matthew watched them go, praying for understanding hearts. That Sunday morning, Matthew felt nervous energy humming through the congregation as he prepared for service. When Mick slipped in, wearing clean jeans and a pressed shirt, the whispers started immediately. He took a seat in the back pew, head slightly bowed. Matthew stepped up to the pulpit, his hands resting on his Bible. The same Bible that held David's letter. The letter he still hadn't found the courage to finish reading. Looking out at his congregation, seeing the mixture of judgment and curiosity on their faces, he knew what message needed sharing. "Grace," he began, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger. "It's a word we say often in these walls. We sing about amazing grace, pray for God's grace, talk about extending grace to others." He paused, making eye contact with various members. But how often do we truly live it? As he spoke about second chances and God's endless capacity for forgiveness, he saw tears in some eyes, thoughtful nods from others. Grace isn't just a pretty word for Sunday mornings. It's the hand reaching down when we're in our darkest pit. It's the light that finds us when we think we're too far gone. It's the love that says, "You're worth more than your worst mistakes." Near the end of the service, while the closing hymn played, little Sarah Miller, barely 6 years old, broke away from her mother. She ran straight to the back pew, clutching a piece of paper. The congregation held its collective breath as she approached Mick. "I drawed this for you," she announced proudly, holding up her crayon artwork. "It's a cross, see? 'Cause Jesus loves everybody, even if they look scary sometimes." For a moment, the only sound was the soft organ music. Then Mick smiled. A real, open smile that transformed his whole face. "Thank you, little lady," he said softly, carefully taking the drawing as if it were made of gold. "This might be the nicest gift I've ever gotten." That evening, as they locked up the church, Mick stood looking at the cross hanging behind the pulpit. "Your son," he said quietly. "David used to say grace was the hardest word in any language. Said it was harder than sorry or goodbye, or even I love you. Took me years to understand what he meant." Matthew felt tears prick his eyes as he nodded. "How so?" "Because grace means accepting what you don't deserve, means believing you're worth more than your sins. That's the hardest thing of all. They finished locking up in understanding silence, the evening crickets beginning their nightly chorus as they walked home through the gathering dusk. A week passed like molasses in summer. The humid Alabama air grew thick with tension as whispers spread through Mason Ridge about the tattooed stranger living behind Pastor Turner's house. The morning calm Matthew once enjoyed was now punctuated by concerned phone calls and unexpected visits from church members. Mrs. Betty Thompson, who'd played the organ at First Baptist for 35 years, called early Monday morning. "Pastor, I just don't feel comfortable bringing my grandchildren to church anymore," she said, her voice quivering with practiced concern. "Not with that man there." By Wednesday, 4 more families had called with similar messages. Matthew sat at his kitchen table, watching through the window as Mick tended to the garden, showing neighborhood kids how to check if the tomatoes were ripe. The sight made his heart ache. Here was a man trying so hard to do good, yet the town seemed determined to see only his past. The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon at Mason's general store. Matthew and Mick had gone to buy supplies for the church repairs. As they approached the counter with their items, old Joe Mason himself stepped out from behind the register. "I can serve you, Pastor Turner," Joe said, his face hard. "But not him. We don't serve criminals here." The store fell silent. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone's shopping basket clattered to the floor. Matthew stood straighter, his voice calm but firm. "Joe Mason, I've known you 40 years. Your daddy and I served on the church board together. You know what Scripture says about judgment and mercy." "Bible also says to be wise as serpents," Joe shot back. "That man's kind brings nothing but trouble." "That man," Matthew replied, "has done more good work for our church in 1 week than some folks who've sat in those pews for decades." He placed his items on the counter, meeting Joe's eyes. Ephesians 4, verse 32. "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." The silence stretched like taffy. Finally, Joe rang up their items, his movements stiff with disapproval. That evening, Matthew found Mick packing his few belongings into his saddlebags. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he already knew. "Making things easier for you, Pastor," Mick said quietly. "Town's turned against you because of me. It ain't right." Matthew stepped into the workshop, his hand resting on the workbench where they'd first connected over that broken motorcycle. "If God sent you here, I won't send you away," he said firmly. "Sometimes the Lord works in ways that make folks uncomfortable. Maybe that's exactly what this town needs." Mick's hands stilled on his bags. "You sure about that?" "As sure as I am that the sun will rise tomorrow." To keep their minds off the town's judgment, they threw themselves into a new project. The old youth center behind the church had stood empty for years, its paint peeling and doors hanging crooked. Every morning, they worked side by side, scraping old paint, replacing rotted boards, and hanging new doors. The neighborhood kids, immune to adult prejudices, would often stop by to help, fascinated by Mick's tattoos and Matthew's stories. One quiet afternoon, while Mick was up on a ladder painting trim, Matthew finally found the courage to read David's entire letter. He sat in the shade of an old oak tree, hands trembling as he unfolded the worn paper. "Dear Dad," it began, "if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I know we left things broken between us, and that's been eating at me every day. Pride is a terrible thing. Yours and mine both. I was so angry when I left, so sure I was right and you were wrong. But war changes a man's perspective, makes him see what really matters." Matthew had to pause, wiping his eyes before continuing. "Remember when I was 10, and you caught me lying about breaking Mrs. Johnson's window? You didn't punish me right away. Instead, you sat me down and told me about your father, how he taught you that a man's word was his bond. You said integrity wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about facing them honestly and making them right. I've carried that lesson with me, Dad, even when I wasn't living it. The letter went on, describing David's experiences in Afghanistan, the men he'd served with, the lives he'd saved and lost. Then came the part about Mick. There's a man here, Dad, named Mick Callahan. He reminds me of myself in some ways. Stubborn, lost, fighting against grace. But God's doing something in his life, something beautiful and broken all at once. If you ever meet him, and something tells me you might, forgive him as you would forgive me. He's carrying guilt that isn't his to bear, just like I've carried the weight of our broken relationship. Tears flowed freely now as Matthew read the final paragraphs. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry for every harsh word, every slammed door, every Sunday I could have come home but let pride stop me. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a man of God, even when I wasn't ready to receive that lesson. If I don't make it back, please know that my last thoughts were of home, of you, and of the grace that's bigger than all our mistakes. Your son, David. Matthew sat there for a long time, letter in hand, praying through his tears. He could see God's hand so clearly now, bringing Mick to his gate that hot afternoon, orchestrating this divine appointment of mercy and healing. But he kept the letter's contents to himself, sensing that the timing wasn't right to share it with Mick. God had brought them this far. He would reveal the rest in his perfect time. Looking up, he watched Mick carefully painting the trim around the youth center's windows, his movements precise and careful. The man's tattoos told stories of a hard past, but his actions spoke of a heart yearning for redemption, just like David had seen. Need any help up there? Matthew called, tucking the letter safely away. Always room for one more painter, Mick answered with a small smile. These windows won't trim themselves. Matthew climbed the ladder to join him, their brushes moving in tandem as the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold. Sometimes, he realized, grace looked like fresh paint on old walls and second chances offered freely, even when the whole world said no. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over Mason Ridge. Matthew sat in his study, Bible open on his desk, but his eyes were fixed on David's photo. The sermon notes before him spoke of grace, redemption, and the unexpected ways God brings healing. He'd titled it, Grace on Two Wheels, thinking of that broken-down Harley that had brought Mick to his gate. The church filled slowly that morning. Familiar faces mixed with concerned glances as Mick slipped into his usual back pew. Matthew noticed Deacon Samuel Price whispering to several board members, their frowns deepening. But today, Matthew felt a strength beyond himself. He stepped to the pulpit, adjusting his glasses. Good morning, family, he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner. Today, I want to talk about how God's grace sometimes comes roaring down a dusty road when we least expect it. The congregation stirred. This wasn't his usual style of preaching. 2 weeks ago, a motorcycle broke down in front of my house. Now, I'll be honest, when I saw that tattooed man in leather, my first thought wasn't about grace. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the pews. But God had other plans. That broken bike brought me face to face with my own broken heart. Matthew's voice grew stronger as he shared the story of meeting Mick, carefully weaving in scripture about forgiveness and second chances. He spoke of David without breaking, though his heart trembled. Sometimes we think we know what grace looks like. We expect it to come wearing a suit and tie, speaking proper, and looking respectable. He paused, looking directly at Deacon Price. But friends, grace rode into Nazareth on a donkey. It walked with tax collectors and fishermen, and sometimes it rolls up on a Harley Davidson. The silence in the church grew deeper, more attentive. Even the children sat still, caught by the power of his words. "We've all got something broken in us," Matthew continued. "Some visible, like tattoos and scars, others hidden, like pride and unforgiveness. But grace, real grace, rides faster than hate. It outruns our prejudices, our fears, our judgments, and it always, always carries the fingerprints of God." Mrs. Johnson, the choir director, wiped her eyes. Several others nodded, including some who'd been among the most vocal critics. "Before I close," Matthew said, "I want to open the floor. Sometimes testimony is the purest form of worship. Would anyone like to share how God's grace has touched their life?" The silence stretched. Then, from the back pew, Mick stood slowly. His hands gripped the pew in front of him, knuckles white. The entire congregation turned to look. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I've done things I ain't proud of. Been places no man should go." His rough voice carried clearly in the hushed sanctuary. "Spent 15 years with the Hells Angels. Did time in prison. Drugs, violence, you name it, I probably did it." Several gasps echoed through the church. But Mick kept going, his voice growing stronger. "Then I met this soldier in Afghanistan, David Turner. He was different, talked about grace like it was real, not just some church word. When our convoy got hit, he threw himself on top of me, saved my life, but he..." Mick's voice broke again. "He didn't make it." Matthew gripped the pulpit, tears flowing freely now. The congregation sat transfixed. "I've been running ever since, trying to find peace, trying to understand why I lived and he died. Then my bike breaks down right in front of his daddy's house." Mick looked directly at Matthew. "And for the first time in my life, I understand what David meant about grace. It ain't about deserving. It's about God using broken things to make something beautiful." The church fell completely silent. You could hear the old ceiling fans whirring overhead. Then, slowly, Deacon Price stood up. For a moment, tension filled the air, but instead of speaking, he began to clap. The sound echoed lonely at first. Then others joined in. Soon the whole church was on their feet, applauding not just Mick's courage, but the miracle they were witnessing. As the service ended, the surprise continued. A rumble of motorcycles filled the parking lot. 6 bikes pulled up, their riders clean-cut despite their leather jackets. Mick's eyes widened in recognition. "Johnny? Marcus? What are you all doing here?" The men, former riding partners, now several years sober, embraced Mick warmly. They'd heard through the grapevine that he was staying at a church in Mason Ridge. "We've been praying for you, brother," Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion. "When we heard where you were, we had to come see for ourselves." The bikers introduced themselves to Matthew, shaking his hand with respect. "We've got some construction experience," Marcus offered. "Heard you might need help with that roof." The congregation lingered, watching this unexpected scene unfold. Several church members who'd been standoffish before came forward to welcome the newcomers. Mrs. Johnson immediately started organizing a potluck lunch. As the afternoon faded into evening, Matthew and Mick sat on the porch, drinking sweet tea and watching lightning flash in the distant clouds. The day felt surreal, a testament to how God could transform hearts and heal wounds decades in the making. "Your son would be proud of you, Pastor," Mick said softly. "The way you stood up for me, even when it wasn't popular." Matthew smiled, about to respond, when headlights swept across the yard. A patrol car pulled up quietly under the old oak tree, its blue lights off but engine running. Deputy Carter stepped out of his patrol car, his face drawn with obvious discomfort. The young officer's footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel as he approached the porch, his hat clutched respectfully in his hands. The lightning flashed again in the distance, illuminating his troubled expression. "Evening, Pastor Turner," Carter said softly. "Mr. Callahan." Matthew felt his stomach tighten. He'd known Carter since the boy was in his Sunday school class, had watched him grow into the badge he now wore. "What brings you out this late, Deputy?" Matthew asked, though something in his heart already knew. Carter shifted his weight, unable to meet either man's eyes. "Sir, I'm real sorry about this, but there's an outstanding warrant for Mr. Callahan from Shelby County, from about 8 years back." Mick sat very still, his tea glass frozen halfway to his lips. "What's the charge?" Matthew asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Assault, sir. 2nd degree." Carter pulled out a folded paper from his back pocket. "I wouldn't be here if I had any choice, Pastor. You know that." Matthew stood up, drawing himself to his full height. "Now you listen here, Deputy. This man sitting next to me isn't the same person who committed those crimes. He's changed. Anyone with eyes can see that." "Sir, He's been helping rebuild our church, mentoring our youth." "It's all right, Pastor," Mick interrupted quietly. He set his glass down and stood up slowly, hands raised slightly. "Deputy's just doing his job." Carter produced his handcuffs with visible reluctance. "I have to take you in, sir. Protocol." "Don't fight for me," Mick said, turning to Matthew. His eyes were calm, accepting. "I need to pay my dues. Maybe this is part of making things right." Matthew watched helplessly as Carter secured the cuffs around Mick's wrists. The metal clicked with a finality that seemed to echo in the humid night air. "I'll make sure he's treated fairly, Pastor," Carter promised softly. As they walked toward the patrol car, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Matthew stood on his porch, feeling every one of his 72 years weighing on his shoulders. He watched until the red taillights disappeared around the curve, then went inside and prayed through the night. The news spread through Mason Ridge like wildfire. By morning, the phone was ringing off the hook. Matthew had barely finished his morning devotional when he heard cars pulling up outside. Through the window, he recognized the vehicles belonging to the church board members. They filed into his living room: Deacon Price, Sister Martha, Brother Jenkins, and 3 others. Their faces were set in stern lines. "Matthew," Deacon Price began, "we've come to discuss a serious matter." "I imagine you have," Matthew replied, remaining standing. "The reputation of our church is at stake," Sister Martha cut in. "Harboring a known criminal? The community is in an uproar." "We're requesting you step down as pastor," Brother Jenkins said firmly, "at least until you clean your house of this situation." Matthew felt a surge of righteous anger he hadn't experienced since his army days. "Clean my house?" he repeated slowly. "Like the Pharisees wanted to clean God's house of tax collectors and sinners?" "Now, Matthew. No." His voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of faithful service. "I will not step down, and I will not denounce a man who God himself led to my door." "You can't be certain of that," Sister Martha protested. "I am certain. As certain as I am that the same Jesus who ate with sinners would have given Mick a place at his table." Matthew looked each board member in the eye. "If you want my resignation, you'll have to force it. But know this, you'll be answering to a higher authority than the church board." They left in uncomfortable silence, leaving Matthew to make some difficult decisions. He drove to the bank and withdrew most of his savings, money he'd been setting aside for a new church roof. By early afternoon, he was at the county jail, posting Mick's bail. The drive home was quiet, broken only by Mick's occasional murmured thanks and apologies. But when they turned onto Matthew's street, both men stiffened at the sight of his fence. Crude letters had been spray-painted across the white boards. "Traitor to your own." Matthew parked the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Mick said nothing, but his face had gone pale beneath his tan. That evening, neither man could eat. The food sat untouched on their plates as Matthew bowed his head and prayed aloud. Lord, we need your protection now. Give us strength to face whatever comes. Help us remember that your Son was also rejected by his own people, also misunderstood by those who should have known better. Guard our hearts against bitterness, and show us the path you want us to walk. Amen. Mick remained silent throughout the prayer, his expression unreadable. After helping clean up the untouched dinner, he retreated to the back room. Matthew heard him moving around for a while. Then all went quiet. In the gray hours before dawn, Matthew woke to the sound of paper sliding under his door. By the time he got up, the house was empty. On his kitchen table lay Mick's motorcycle keys and a handwritten note. You fixed more than my bike, old man. You fixed me, but I can't fix what I've done. Matthew walked out onto his porch as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The space where Mick's Harley had been parked was empty now. In the distance, thunder rolled across the morning sky, a low rumble that seemed to echo the ache in his heart. The old pastor stood there for a long while, watching the sunrise and holding the keys to a bike whose rider had vanished like morning mist. The slurs on his fence seemed to mock him in the growing light, but somehow they didn't hurt as much as the empty space in his driveway. The mornings felt different now. Matthew noticed it most when he'd wake before dawn, expecting to hear the quiet shuffle of boots on his back porch or the gentle clink of coffee cups being set out. But there was only silence, broken by the occasional song of an early bird or the whisper of wind through the oak trees. Days stretched into weeks, each one carrying its own weight of absence. The house seemed to have grown larger, its rooms echoing with memories of laughter that had briefly filled them. Matthew kept to his routines, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of daily life, but everything felt a shade dimmer, like sunlight filtering through dusty windows. Every morning, without fail, he'd walk out to his workshop where Mick's motorcycle stood, carefully covered with a tarp. He'd pull back the corner just enough to check on it, running his weathered hand along the polished chrome. Sometimes he'd talk to it, as if it could somehow carry his words to its absent rider. Still keeping her safe for you, he'd murmur, then carefully replace the tarp. The garden became his sanctuary. Matthew spent hours there, coaxing life from the rich Alabama soil. He planted tomatoes and peppers, tending them with careful hands while his mind wandered to deeper things. The physical work helped quiet his thoughts, though they never truly settled. His Bible studies continued, but the crowd had thinned considerably. Where once 20 or 30 people would gather in his living room, now only 8 or 9 showed up regularly. They were the faithful ones, those who saw past the gossip and remembered the man who had ministered to them through births and deaths, marriages and divorces. Sister Johnson, bless her heart, still brought her famous pound cake every Wednesday night. "Don't you worry about those others, Pastor," she'd say, setting the cake on his kitchen counter. "The Lord knows who's got the right heart in this matter." He'd smile and thank her, grateful for the handful who stood by him. But the empty chairs spoke volumes, and sometimes the weight of disappointment settled heavy on his shoulders. In quiet moments, Matthew would take out David's letter, now worn at the creases from frequent reading. The words hadn't changed, but somehow they seemed to carry new meaning each time he read them. "Dear Dad, I'm writing this from a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The sun's setting over the mountains, painting everything gold, and it reminds me of those evenings we used to spend on the porch before I let my pride get in the way." He'd trace his finger over the words, feeling the indentations David's pen had left in the paper. The letter spoke of regret, of love, of hopes for reconciliation that would never come to pass. But now, having met Mick, Matthew understood more deeply what his son had become in those final years. A man who reached out to the broken and lost, just as Jesus had done. One particularly rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled across the sky and rain drummed steadily on the roof, Matthew heard the distinctive sound of mail dropping through his slot. Among the usual bills and church newsletters, there was a plain envelope with a county jail return address. His heart quickened as he recognized Mick's distinctive handwriting. Settling into his favorite armchair, Matthew carefully opened the letter. The paper was cheap, institutional grade, but the words were carefully written. Dear Pastor Matthew, first, I want you to know I'm doing okay. 3 meals a day and a roof over my head. Can't complain too much about that. But more importantly, I wanted to thank you. Not just for the bail attempt, though that meant more than you know, but for showing me what real grace looks like. You welcomed me when others would have turned me away. You defended me when it cost you dearly. You showed me what my friend David always talked about, that faith isn't just words in a book, but love in action. I've been leading a Bible study here in the jail. Can you believe that? Me, the ex-Hell's Angel, teaching others about Jesus. Some of the guys remind me of myself, back when David first found me. They're starting to ask questions about faith, about forgiveness, about whether God could really love someone like them. I tell them about you, Pastor, about how you fixed more than just my bike. You helped fix my soul. If I get out of here, I promise you I'm going to live differently. Your son saved my life once in Afghanistan. Now you've saved it again, in a different way. Your friend, I hope I can still say that. Mickey Matthew had to remove his glasses and wipe his eyes before he could finish reading. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he folded it carefully and held it against his heart. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, a warm certainty had begun to grow. That evening, as darkness settled over Mason Ridge, Matthew lit a single candle and placed it in his window. The flame danced gently, casting soft shadows on the wall. Kneeling beside his bed, as he had done every night for decades, he began to pray. Lord, he whispered, tonight I want to lift up both my sons to you. David, my boy by blood who taught me more about love and sacrifice than I ever taught him. And Mick, my son by grace, who you sent to help heal this old man's heart. Watch over him in that jail cell. Guide his steps. Help him know that he's not alone. The candle flickered, its light reaching out into the darkness like hope itself. Matthew remained there, head bowed, letting tears of gratitude mix with his prayers. In the quiet of his room, he felt a peace that transcended understanding, a certainty that God was working in ways he couldn't yet see. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, like nature itself was whispering prayers into the night. Matthew thought about the garden he'd tend tomorrow, the motorcycle he'd check on, the Bible study he'd led. Each task was a small act of faith, a way of saying he believed in something bigger than the current trials. He thought about David's words in his letter. If you ever meet a man named Mick, forgive him as you would forgive me. Now he understood. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about love, about seeing past the surface to the heart God was transforming. David had seen it in Mick years ago in Afghanistan. Now Matthew saw it too. The candle continued to burn, a beacon of hope in the window of a house that felt a little less empty, a little less cold, filled with the warmth of prayers for 2 sons, one watching from heaven, one behind bars, both held in the heart of a father who had learned that love knows no bounds. The late summer storm rolled across Mason Ridge with fierce intensity. Lightning split the darkened sky as thunder shook the window panes of Matthew's modest home. He sat in his usual chair, a worn Bible open on his lap, trying to focus on the verses despite nature's fury outside. Then he heard it, a deep rumbling that didn't match the thunder's pattern. Matthew pushed himself up from his chair and moved to the window, his aged joints protesting the quick movement. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could barely make out the blue and red flashing lights cutting through the downpour. Behind those police lights, a string of headlights stretched down the road like a chain of stars. His heart began to race as the convoy drew closer. Motorcycles, dozens of them, rolled up his street in an orderly line, their riders hunched against the driving rain. The police cruiser at the front pulled to the side, its lights still spinning, creating an otherworldly scene in the storm. One by one, the bikes came to a stop. Their engines cut out in sequence, leaving only the sound of rain and distant thunder. Matthew watched, transfixed, as the riders began removing their helmets. Men and women of every age and background emerged from beneath their protective gear, their faces illuminated by occasional lightning flashes. But it was the figure at the front that made Matthew's breath catch in his throat. There stood Mick, rain streaming down his face, holding something in his hands. Despite being soaked to the bone, he wore a smile that seemed to light up the stormy night. Matthew's hands trembled as he opened his front door. By now, curious townspeople had begun emerging from their homes and shops, drawn by the unusual spectacle. They gathered under awnings and porches, watching as Mick climbed the steps to Matthew's porch. "Pastor?" Mick said, his voice thick with emotion. In his hands were two treasures, a worn Bible and the folded letter from David. Both showed signs of frequent handling, their pages soft with use. "I read this to everyone I met," he continued, gesturing to the items, "and they started believing change is possible." Without hesitation, Matthew stepped forward and wrapped his arms around the bigger man. Their tears mingled with the rain as they embraced, two men transformed by grace and second chances. The gathered crowd had grown larger now, and Mick turned to address them. "We're starting something new," he announced, his voice carrying over the storm. "A biker outreach group called Road to Mercy, because everyone deserves the kind of grace this man showed me." The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Mason Ridge Baptist Church, casting rainbow patterns across pews that hadn't been this full in decades. People squeezed shoulder to shoulder in the wooden seats, while others stood along the walls and filled the center aisle. The familiar scent of old hymnals and polished wood mixed with the unusual aroma of leather as dozens of bikers occupied the back rows. Their jackets caught everyone's attention, black leather adorned with a new patch that showed a cross wrapped in flames with the word "Redeemed" emblazoned beneath it. The sight made Matthew's heart swell as he watched from his usual seat near the pulpit. When Mick stood and made his way to the front, the rustle of movement stilled to complete silence. His hands shook as he pulled David's letter from his pocket, the paper worn soft from countless readings. The morning light caught the tears in his eyes as he cleared his throat. "This letter," Mick began, his deep voice wavering, "was written by a soldier named David Turner, a man who saved my life in more ways than one." He unfolded the paper carefully, like handling a precious artifact. As Mick read the words aloud, David's voice seemed to fill the sanctuary. The letter spoke of deep remorse for years of anger, of love that never died, and of hopes for forgiveness that David feared would come too late. The congregation sat motionless, many wiping tears as the raw emotion in the words touched their hearts. When Mick finished reading, the silence felt heavy enough to touch. Then Matthew rose slowly from his seat, his eyes glistening but his voice strong and clear. "I forgive you both," he declared, opening his arms wide. Mick stepped down from the pulpit and met Matthew in front of the altar. The two men embraced tightly, their shoulders shaking with emotion. Someone in the back began to hum softly, and then a voice started singing, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." The hymn spread through the church like a gentle wave, growing stronger with each voice that joined in. Soon the whole congregation was singing, their voices lifting in perfect harmony until the very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. In that holy moment, no one saw color or class or past sins. They saw only grace, made real and tangible before their eyes. The seasons turned gently in Mason Ridge, and with them came a transformation that touched more than just the changing leaves. The old church building, once showing its age through leaky roofs and creaking steps, now stood proud with fresh paint and solid repairs. Inside, the wooden pews gleamed with polish, and new cushions made Sunday services more comfortable for the growing congregation. The youth center buzzed with life again. Where empty rooms had gathered dust, now teenagers played basketball and younger kids worked on homework after school. The walls displayed artwork created by both church kids and reformed bikers, telling stories of second chances. The Road to Mercy ministry had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Every weekend, groups of bikers wearing their redeemed patches rode out to prisons and rallies across Alabama. They shared their stories openly, tales of darkness turned to light, of grace found in unexpected places. Mick led these missions with a gentle strength that reminded Matthew more and more of David. Matthew himself had changed. The quiet loneliness that once shadowed his days had lifted. His eyes sparkled with new purpose, and his sermons carried fresh fire. The neighborhood children still came by to learn about tools, but now they also brought their parents, who stayed for coffee and conversation. One crisp autumn morning, as Matthew tended his garden, the familiar rumble of Mick's Harley approached. Mick pulled up to the gate, a second helmet hanging from his arm, and a grin on his face. "How about a ride, Pastor?" Mick called out. Matthew looked up from his tomato plants and chuckled. "At my age?" "Age is just a number," Mick replied, holding out the helmet. "Besides, I promised to drive careful." After a moment's hesitation, Matthew wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over. "Well, why not?" he said, accepting the helmet. They roared down the country road together, the wind whipping at their clothes. Matthew's deep laugh mingled with Mick's as they leaned into curves and straightened out on long stretches. The morning sun warmed their backs as they rode to the hill, where Matthew had often come alone to pray for David. They stopped at the overlook, killing the engine. The valley spread out below them, painted in autumn colors. Matthew closed his eyes, feeling the breeze on his face. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for sending me my son one more time." The morning sun caught the chrome of the motorcycle as they mounted up again, the road ahead stretching endless and golden, their path of grace leading on toward new horizons. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.